All right, session 5, encumbrances and liens. So remember, we're building a foundation. We've talked about ownership, we've talked about rights. Now we're going to go into a little bit of detail about how other things can influence your rights to your property. Encumbrances, also liens we're going to get into. But encumbrances are any physical thing that could interfere with your complete ownership of your property or even property boundaries. So imagine, and you have an illustration in your book that'll lay it out, but imagine this is your property line and maybe there's a next door neighbor that has a privacy fence and their privacy fence creeps over onto your property line. That would be called an encumbrance. And people ask me all the time, you know, there's a property boundary dispute. My next door neighbor's storage shed was installed on my property. You know, what can I do about it? So does the neighbor own your property now because he fenced it in? No, because remember in the very beginning we said that you buy your specific property with the specific boundaries, and that's why the rights included with that purchase of the property are so important. Just because the neighbor has a tree or a building or a fence that encroaches on your property, it's an encumbrance to your ownership. It interferes with your rights to use your entire property, but it doesn't mean that he owns it. So again, make sure that you're keeping that concept straight in your head. So an encumbrance, your book says, is a non-possessory interest limiting the legal owner's rights. Big words, but remember the whole non-possessory thing. Non-possessory, they don't own it, they don't have it. Non-possessory interest, but it does interfere with the owner's rights in the property. Now, next is an easement. Remember I talked before about selling my pond but retaining the right to be able to go fish in the pond if I wanted to? Well, I can give people permission to use my property. If I want that permission to be guaranteed and noted and recorded, then maybe I would want an easement. And we're going to get into some pretty deep details about different types of easements and why they're important. Remember I said you got to open your mind. We automatically think it's my property. I don't want anybody on it. I don't want anybody doing anything. Why would I give somebody an easement? But there's actually several reasons for that we're going to talk about. First one, easement appurtenant. Easement appurtenant always has two different properties in consideration at the same time. One is what they call a dominant tenement, and the other is servient. Dominant, it dominates over. Servient, it has to serve up access. So excuse me for 1 second, I forgot to bring my little board onto the screen. Hope you don't mind too much. But I did want to draw out one little illustration for you so that you can have that in your head. So imagine this was your property. Maybe this is the road access. You're also going to learn that everybody has to have driveway access to have ingress and egress from your property, right? So maybe I have sold the back half. How am I going to get to the road? Which property do you think is going to have to serve up access to the other? This is going to be your servient property, your servient tenement. Which one's going to dominate over the other? That's going to be this one, right? How am I going to get to the road? I could have an easement of access to go across his property. Now, could he get tired of me making tracks in the yard and put up a fence? Not if I have an easement. He would have to give me that access. Do I own this property? No, I don't. I just have an easement. Because remember, we're talking about rights of ownership and rights of use. An easement is a right of one person to use someone else's property. People always say, well, I've heard of flagpole lots, that you can own a flagpole lot. Well, and that's perfectly fine. But in that case, what you need to do is make an agreement with this guy to buy this property, have it all resurveyed, and guess what? Now you own the driveway with a flagpole lot. But don't get confused rights of ownership and rights of access or use, because if you do get those two concepts confused, none of the rest of it's going to make sense. So next we're going to go into how easements are created. That's the boring stuff. Creation and termination, it's a list. Memorize it. It's important. Encroachments. We talked about encumbrances already. Encumbrances are everything that interferes in individual right. Now we're going to talk about encroachments. Every time I hear encroachments, I think of my old Southern grandmother, and she would always say cockroaches. And I'm deathly afraid of roaches. So every time I hear encroachments, I think about roaches. I don't want them on our property. So encroachments are usually physical aspects of someone else's property that creeps over into ours. So I've already made the example about the privacy fence. That would definitely be an encroachment. Someone else's property or someone else's access that is a physical interference in our right to use the land. So let's talk a little bit next about deed restrictions. We're going to dive deeper into this later whenever we look at deeds in detail. But remember, if I'm selling a car, anything personal property, if I'm selling a personal property, I'm going to use a bill of sale. But if I'm selling real property and all those things included in the real property, what am I going to use? It's going to be a deed. For every piece of property, there is somewhere at the courthouse filed where that property is located, which we're also going to talk about in deeper detail later. There is a deed on file that tells you who the owner or owners are and what the physical boundary of that property is, that real legal description. So there's a deed on file somewhere. Deed restrictions that you're going to learn about in this chapter mean that a previous owner put some restriction in the deed that's going to carry over to future owners. Like I said, we're going to take a deeper dive into that later. So if it's not 100% clear in this session, don't worry about it, because remember, we're introducing future concepts as we build on the material. You're also going to have a brief introduction to liens in this property. A lien could also be considered an encumbrance, could also be considered another interference in your full right to the property, but liens are usually not a physical thing, it's more a financial. So if I had a pool installed in my backyard and I didn't pay for it, that mechanic could take me to court or sue me if I didn't pay him for the money or pay him the money I owed him, put a lien on my property. Again, we're going to talk about deeds later, but that lien would be attached to my deed. I couldn't sell that property until I paid him off. So don't you kind of see how that could also be an encumbrance? A mortgage would be an encumbrance. That's also a lien. Anything that interferes with a personal or private property owner's rights is considered an encumbrance, and liens do fall into that. So remember, we talked about the physical aspect. That's the financial aspect. You're going to go into some pretty deep detail about the different types of liens, how they take priority, what order they get paid off, and later when we talk about deeds in more detail, it's going to make more sense. But just remember, we can't sell a property if there are liens attached to it without those financial burdens, encumbrances, being paid off first. So again, we're laying a foundation, but it's really important to be aware of what liens are, how they attach to property, because it's definitely an encumbrance on the original owner. And then of course the last section is the you don't pay, you don't stay section. We're going to talk about foreclosures. Nobody wants to hear about that, but we're talking about property and ownership rights. Property has a lien on it in the shape of something like a mortgage. If I don't pay my mortgage, they can take my property. And there are different state rules, different guidelines for how foreclosures are handled. In some states, you have to go to court and actually see a judge for that foreclosure to take place. Other states, they just have to announce it in the newspaper. So make sure that you know the rules for your specific state, whether you're a judicial court or non-judicial, don't go to court, judicial or non-judicial foreclosure state. Because again, we're looking at national content, you need to know the concepts, but also need to know what your state specific structure is. So you will get through the different types of liens at the end of this chapter. And let's talk about one other thing. If we talked about the difference between rights of ownership and guaranteed rights of use, could something like an encroachment, could it become ownership? Yeah, we talked about that up here. I could buy the property from you. Maybe I could buy the backside of the property on your pond so that I know for sure I have access. Or if I put up that privacy fence, could I ever have guaranteed access to your property even though I don't own it because I put up the fence? We don't like to think about it, but yes, if that encroachment is there long enough, the person who has the encroachment could petition the county and get what's called an easement. So we can either have accidental use of that property, or we can petition the owner or the court system to have the guaranteed future right of use in the term of an easement. So again, you're going to take a deeper dive. You're going to learn a whole lot more concepts this section. I think it's really interesting. I think these are some of the things that most people don't really recognize or think about whenever you're learning about real estate. But remember, talking about rights of use, rights of ownership, and how outside influences affect ownership of private property. Enjoy this section.